It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor C Naganna. His topic is on some aspect of literary translations. Professor C Naganna is presently a visiting professor, Kovempu Institute of Kannada Studies, and also a director of the Publication Division, University of Mysore. Formerly, he was an English professor at University of Mysore. His major interests are comparative literature and translation studies. Professor Naganna was a former member of Project Advisor Committee of National Translation Mission. He is a poet, critic, translator, as well as a public speaker. So far, he is an author of 50 books, both in Kannada and English. Professor Naganna was a member of the Kannada Advisory Committee of Bharatiya Nanpith Saraswati Saman, Central Sahitya Academy, and Karnataka Sahitya Academy. As a renowned scholar in his discipline, he received felicitations and honors from various organizations in recognition of his excellent services in the field of literature and culture. With this brief introduction, I invite Sir Naganna to enlighten us with his lecture. Sir, I welcome you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Adapro, for introducing me very warmly to this scholarly assembly. Thank you, Ms. Winston. Before talking about literary translation, I would like to spend a few minutes to understand the usefulness of translation in general. Actually, translation is a process of uniting the world. Translators and interpreters play a great role in society and academia and make sure that all voices are heard. The United Nations General Assembly on May 24th, 2017 adopted a resolution on the role of language professionals in connecting nations and fostering peace, understanding, and development, and declared September 30th as the International Translation Day. Each year, the International Federation of Translators chooses a theme for the year, and this year it was United in Translation. India, being the richest linguistic nation in the world, has always cherished the beauty of multilingualism and cultural diversity. There is a growing awareness that languages play a vital role in preserving cultural diversity and strengthening a knowledge society for sustainable development. Similarly, translation plays an important role in developing one's competence to have a better understanding of religious and cultural diversity through meanings and expressions in any given language. So, as we all know, language is considered to be very dynamic and complex with ever evolving characteristics. Translation as a discipline creates genuine interest and engagement with culture and society. Translation always helps to understand popular phrases, underlying sentiments, and colloquialisms to establish a true understanding between people speaking different languages. Translators have to deal with the 6 different problematic areas in their work. These include lexical semantic problems, grammar, syntax, rhetoric, and pragmatic and cultural issues. Divergent views concerning language and its many functions are reflected in differing approaches to the study of language. At one end, language is considered to be principally instrumental, a skill to use for communicating thoughts and information. At the opposite end, language is understood as an essential element of human beings' thought process, perceptions, and self-expressions. As such, it is considered to be at the core of translingual and transcultural competence. So, while we use language to communicate our needs to others, it simultaneously reveals us to others and to ourselves. So language is a complex, multifunctional phenomenon that links an individual to other individuals, to communities, and to national cultures. So translation has been described as a science, an art, and a skill. It is a science in the sense that it necessitates complete knowledge of the structure and makeup of the two languages concerned. It is an art since it needs artistic talent to rebuild the original text in the form of a product that is presentable to the reader who is not supposed to be familiar with the original. It is also a skill because it reflects the ability to smooth over any difficulty in the translation of something that has no equal in the target language. So translation is ultimately a human activity which enables human beings to exchange ideas and thoughts. Translators and interpreters are playing a great role in society and academia and making sure that all voices are heard and understood by conveying information accurately and sensitively from one language to another. However, translators face problems while translating religious, legal, technical, regional variants, local registers, and feelings and emotions. Since we are dealing with the subject of literary translation, all these things come into play. You have a religious preoccupation, legal, technical, regional variants, local registers, and feelings and emotions. All these things are reflected in a literary work. So problems in translating the text occurs due to differences in linguistic systems and languages, mostly resulting from non-equivalence between the source language and the target language. There are no universal rules that can be applied to every problem of translation. Translators may approach the same relatively noble, the word noble, when he or she would translate for the people whose stories do not get heard either because they do not have the voice or they do not have access to opportunities to be heard. Therefore, the necessity of a translator is very much underscored here. So, translation is intended to restate in one language what someone else said or wrote in another language. So the translator is under obligation to coordinate his intention with the target reader's expectations so that the product resembles the original text in terms of style and sense without putting the target reader into unnecessary processing of effort. So the translator's competence to understand and render the message into the target language is born out of cognitive and linguistic knowledge. A good piece of translation must deliver the message that is as closely equivalent as possible to the original text. This is what Dr. Winston was referring to during his opening remarks. Therefore, the message should be closely equivalent from when you translate from one language to the other. However, the goal will always be to arrive at the outcome by relating the same meaning and message, if possible, and the same level of generalization. Blessed with a harmony of different languages and cultures. The role of translators will continue to be important to build bridges of understanding between people and cultures. So the International Tongue, February 21st, since 1990, after the declaration by the United Nations to recognize the sacrifices of the people who lost their life for the sake of their mother tongue in Bangladesh. So, February 21st, every year, the Mother Language Day is celebrated to commemorate this tragedy. To every one of us, mother language is one of the most precious gifts that we have in our lives. Each and every language spoken throughout the globe represents a unique and distinct cultural heritage, melodious songs, colorful environment, tasty foods, and a healthy society to live in, where people express their feelings and emotions with each other without any hesitation. The concept of the mother tongue is a fascinating aspect of language that has transcended generations. But today we have to make an attempt to understand the nature of literary translation. Now, take a concrete example of a literary translation. Ted Hughes, the distinguished British poet of the 20th century, translated Sophocles' Greek play into English. Sophocles lived 2,500 years ago. So, in the 20th century, Ted Hughes, the very distinguished poet of England, took it up for translation. So, one of the plays of Sophocles. So, if you go to a supermarket, you will see a row of boxes filled with white powder, and on each of them, you will see the label. It could be sugar, salt, detergent powder, but if you take note of these two examples, one is Ted Hughes' translation of Sophocles' Greek play on the one hand, and the labels that you see in a supermarket as far as the white powders in different boxes are concerned on the other hand. Two examples. So you will find at the top end, Ted Hughes' translation of Sophocles' play. The other one is the white powder whose Greek name is translated into English as the labels suggest. That means literary translation is a distinctive kind of translation. Therefore, we have to consider literary texts separately. Translation experts have drawn our attention to this particular aspect that literary texts demand our special attention as they are very, very special. So, literary translation is different from technical translation, you know at the outset. In his introduction to the book Oxford Guide to Literature in English Translation, Peter Franz says, literary translation is translation designed to be read as literature. Okay? It is just like the original text is read as literature in the source language. In the target language, the translated text is almost like a literary text and it should be read as literature. It's not easy to define what is literary translation because as students of literature, you know very well the concept of what is literature is yet not clearly defined. What is literature? You can't say it in a few words. In the book called Literary Theory, Terry Eagleton, the book came out in 1983, Terry Eagleton puts a question, what is literature? And tries to answer it himself. According to him, literature is best defined as a highly valued kind of writing. I think in 6, 7 words, Terry Eagleton almost seems to have arrived at a best definition. Literature is best defined as a highly valued kind of writing. He continues further and says that literature depends upon the value and value system of a community besides its ideological moorings. We cannot forget the value and value system of a community when we are transacting between two literary works from one language to the other. So, value and value system obviously ought to be taken into account. So, what do we see majorly in literature? To brush up your knowledge, let me recall some of our 4 or 5 points. What do we see majorly in literature? Foregrounding of language is one. The interdependence of different levels of linguistic organization is the second element. The third element is, of course, the separation from the practical context of utterance. So when we say literary text, it is separated from the practical context. The fourth element, of course, is the perception of texts as both aesthetic objects and intertextual constructs. The text actually serve both the purpose. So when we study the translation of literary texts, first of all, we have to solve the institutional issues. For example, the literary studies community must accept the fact that translations are eligible for study. That is the first requirement. This is what we call the institutional issue or the institutional problem. The given community must be in a position to accept the translation work as very legitimate and eligible for study. The comparative literature did not accept translation so easily. After a long battle, I think even comparative literature has accepted translation as a legitimate discipline. So they did not treat translation works as instruments of cultural transmission and negotiation. The American Comparative Literature Association, ACLA, gave 3 reports on professional standards in the year 1965, in 1975, and 1993. They came out with 3 reports, and compared to the first 2 reports, which appeared in 1965 and 1975, the third one appears to be mild and practicable. For example, the 1993 report says the old hostilities toward translation should be mitigated. Now, as this particular statement makes it abundantly clear, the translation was not spontaneously accepted as a legitimate genre of literature or discipline of literature. So therefore, the old hostilities, the enmity, had to be fought because translation is very essential for awareness and the broad basis of interpretation. Without translation, I think broad basis of interpretation is absolutely impossible. Therefore, we have to create an awareness and win the attention as far as the translated texts are concerned. Susan Barsnett, in her 1993 book, Comparative Literature, A Critical Introduction, that is the title of the book, which came out in 1993. I repeat the title of the book, and the author is Susan Barsnett. She has done a marvelous job as far as translation studies is concerned. The title of the book is Comparative Literature, A Critical Introduction. And Barsnett has said that hereafter, the translation studies will grow to be an important discipline. She said it in 1993, and we are in 2021, and with the passage of almost 3 decades, her prophecy has come true. Translation studies everywhere has received adequate attention, and it is a growing subject. So translation studies has emerged as an academic discipline from what was an ancillary status. It occupied a very secondary position earlier on, but now it has come to the center stage, translation studies. That is the salutary development. Translations are not various objects for the source texts. They are the vehicles of thought, attitude, and values. So that is how we have to look at the translations. They are not merely representations of the original texts. They have their own independent existence. They are the vehicles of thought, attitude, and values. Since we are talking of literary translation, we would be greatly benefited by what Robert Bly, 1983, in 1980, he says regarding the stages of literary translation. It's very, very useful tips, I thought. In fact, Robert Bly comes out with the 8 tips, 8 points, as far as literary translation is concerned. And according to Bly, a translator of poetry passes through 8 stages. This is translation of poetry, but I think more or less the same thing applies, with a little bit difference regarding the translation of prose, fiction, essays, and so on and so forth. So point number one, he gets the literal version first. Any translator, after going through a given poem, gets the literal translation version first, literal version. Second, he establishes the general meaning of the poem. Third, he adapts to the acceptable language what he has translated. Fourth, he takes care of a particular idiom. That is also very important. He draws us to the fifth point. He draws us to the environment of the poem. The translator, draws us to the environment of the poem. Sixth point, he thinks about the verbal design. Seventh, he discusses his drafts with the language users. That is another important aspect. We shall not forget its usefulness, because we have to discuss the draft with the language users. Eighth and the last point regarding translation of a poem or poetry, the final version is prepared after going through all the 7 stages or 8 stages. Only after 1980s, there has been an emphasis on translation in the wake of translation studies. In literary translation in particular, and translation in general, who translates what, when, how, for whom, in what context, with what effect, and why becomes important. I repeat, who translates what, when, how, for whom, in what context, with what effect, and why. All these things become important. The last question refers to the fact why the translators have chosen a particular text for translation. A translator will be an agent and a part of the grid of symbolic power relations. All these things, I'm sure, have been already touched by other speakers who have dealt with the topic of post-colonialism, so on and so forth, in this vis-a-vis translation. So a translator will be an agent and a part of the grid of symbolic power relations. And hence translation will have lost its philological innocence. Hitherto we believed that philology, or the centrality of linguistic component, is very important, meaning, etc., etc. But now beyond meaning, there is this politics. So translation theorists, especially in the post-structuralism context, question the taken for granted assumptions about translation. So very many things were taken for granted, and then all these things have been questioned now in the post-structural context. Translation is not an innocent activity. It takes in some, it excludes some. Therefore, what is included is as important as what is excluded in translation. They will understand the hidden agenda and the declared agenda. Declared agenda is what is seen openly, hidden agenda is something invisible, and the translator is absolutely able to understand what is hidden and what is declared. So it is not difficult to know when translation becomes an instrument of domination and information control. That also need to be taken into account. So when translation becomes an instrument of domination and information control, even among the beginners, there will be some kind of preference as to which work should be taken up for translation. They may notice it deliberately, but their choice or preference itself is an indication of a particular ideological position. Suppose some 10 books are placed before you, the beginners, the students, let us say, and then instinctively, given the background of your mental makeup, your political ideology, your preferences, predilections, so on and so forth, you will automatically pick up one book and leave out the rest. And that book is a reflection of your ideological predilection, so to say. Even as they make progress in the field of translation, they will get more and more clarity regarding the choice of the text, and the purpose behind it. Therefore, it's imperative that one must exercise caution regarding anti-progressive and reactionary texts. There are very many texts which can be labeled as anti-progressive and reactionary. When the power hunger of the ruling class is at its peak, a translator has to think twice before undertaking any translation that promotes the ideology of the ruling class. So therefore, extremely cautious the translator would be. Once the translator comes out of his ancillary status, because the translator is no longer occupying the ancillary status anymore, he has occupied the center stage. He has come to occupy the center stage. Therefore, once he comes out of his ancillary status, he has to shoulder all the responsibilities mentioned above. When once the translator reaches the truth, that translation is a phenomenon worthy of attention. He cannot indulge in reactionary activities. He has to move with the progressive attitude. Just as a writer has to be extremely cautious regarding anti-progressive material, so also a translator ought to be equally vigilant to avoid such an unworthy material. I straight away call that material unworthy, which is reactionary and not progressive, which is anti-progressive. This is because just as a writer writes so that people may live and flourish, a translator is equally concerned about the well-being of his audience. He's not a lifeless automaton. He's not controlled by some invisible hands like an automaton. He is very much alive to his surroundings, to his context. Therefore, just as an original writer thinks about the well-being of his community, his audience, the translator is equally concerned with his audience, with his readers, with his community. Therefore, he will be doubly careful in picking up a work of art or a literary work for translation. Just as a writer has to be extremely cautious. So this is because just as a writer is responsible to his community, answerable to his community, a translator is equally held responsible, and therefore his position is not ancillary anymore. In India, cases of literate bilingualism are very, very common. In the Kannada context, because most of you would have Tamil as your mother tongue, therefore, whatever I say regarding Kannada vis-a-vis English, I think more or less it applies to Tamil and English. Therefore, by way of example and illustration, I am invoking a couple of examples so that you can place that in your own mother tongue context. P.M. Shrikantaya and A.K. Ramanujan can be taken as an example. You will understand who this B.M. Shrikantaya is. A.K. Ramanujan, probably you have heard, you have read his poems or his translation theory, his most famous Speaking of Shiva, the English translation of the 12th century Sharanas of Karnataka. It has become very, very famous. So A.K. Ramanujan and Professor B.M. Shrikantaya can be taken as an example. They are a perfect examples of what can be called polyvalence. Polyvalence is practicing the full continuum of writing functions. For example, both of them were Kannada poets, they were English writers, and scholars and translators. This is what we call writing polyvalence, multiple capacity, capacious brains they were. Both of them wrote in Kannada, both of them were well versed in English, and they were poets, scholars, and translators. In India, we notice the dynamics and values of multilingualism, not even bilingualism. In India, we always, talk in terms of multilingualism. Also, we come across cultural relations between unequal partners. That is also not unusual. As cultural theorist Aijaz Ahmad says, civilizational complexity of India is inaccessible to Western scholarship. Very true. Very true. It is mind boggling. That's why I said multilingualism as far as the Indian context is concerned. So, Dr. Aijaz Ahmad, cultural theorist, says civilizational complexity of India is inaccessible to Western scholarship. Translation theorists Sujit Mukherjee and G.N. Devi show how the intents and effects of translation in India is to be understood within the long tradition of rewriting. Long tradition of rewriting, which was touched upon in the opening remarks by Dr. Winston. This gives translation the authority and legitimacy of original texts. Translational relations between Kannada and English provide a rich terrain for the investigation regarding pressures and counter pressures. You can imagine Tamil in the place of Kannada. So translational relations between Tamil and English, I think they provide a rich terrain for the investigation, etc. It's a complex architecture. It is not a simple architecture. It is a complex architecture which reveals the ways in which literary exchanges have moved through a variety of phases. B.M. Srikanthaiah was a professor of English in the 1920s in the University of Mysore, and he was well versed in Kannada. So he is known as the inaugurator of a new trend of poetry in the Kannada language. A professor of English opening a new trend of Kannada writing away from the traditional fixations, so to say. He translated some 60 poems from English into Kannada, and he called the book English Geetagalu, which can be called the lyrical ballads of Kannada literature. This was in 1926. Since all of you are eager to listen about literary translation, let's listen to what B.M. Sri said regarding the texts to be taken up for such a venture. Whenever you pick up a literary text for translation, B.M. Sri said the following: Kannada literature of the last century, when he said the last century, he was obviously referring to the 19th century. Kannada literature of the last century was largely derivative, drawing its sustenance from the past. Mythological and religious narratives, stories for Yakshagana folk theatre, which had very little to do with the contemporary life. So translations serve to help Kannada literature break away from the traditional forms, as indicated by Professor B.M. Srikanthaiah. The period in which B.M. Sri wrote, that is 1920s, was intensely interested in translation as a way of coming to terms with British influence and in altering the canonical forms of Kannada literature, which was running on a particular track for 150 or 200 years nearly. Here comes Professor B.M. Srikanthaiah at the beginning of the 20th century and says, I think it is time for us to break away from the past and inaugurate a new mode of expression in poetry. He did it. M.D. Alasingaracharya, who lived between 1877 and 1940, said in November 1907, I'm quoting these years because they give you an idea of how different epochs have responded to the literary translation per se. Alasingaracharya said, it is wrong to totally decry or accept the West. You can't dismiss the West, neither you can accept it whole and soul. If we reject translations and stick only to our own traditions, we lose out on capitalizing on these traditions. On the other hand, if we study only English and ignore our languages, the study itself will be purposeless. Very, very, very important statement made by Alsingacharya. I repeat the last sentence, which is important for our present purpose. That is, on the other hand, if we study only English and ignore our languages, the study itself will be purposeless. So we have to take care of our languages. At the same time, we must pay attention to the English language, which is looming large on the horizon in such a big way. Therefore, if we can view both languages with an unprejudiced mind, then it will give an impetus to the development of the Kannada language, he said. Therefore, all of us who have English education should never forget our primary aim of improving our own language and our own land. Unless we are bilingual, this is impossible. And I think these are prophetic words uttered by one of the earlier scholars. And we can attain our goal only when we are bilingual. Otherwise, it is impossible to reach the goal, he said. So that is, I think, a very, very considered opinion. And I certainly would like to emphasize this point to you, young audience, that we ought to become bilingual. Monolingualism in a multilingual country will not work. Bilingualism is, yes, certainly bilingual. Multilingual is still very, very welcome. So B.M. Shrikantaya, coming back to B.M. Shrikantaya, he said in 1915, 1915, the following: when our native language is not strong enough, we have to gain that strength through translations. Therefore, all English educated people, if you don't wake up and develop your languages and translate writing that is relevant for us today, we shall excommunicate you. He has said it in anger, perhaps, because being a doyen of the literary world, he said, he summoned the courage to say, we are going to excommunicate you unless you become bilingual and develop your own language, deriving strength from English, he said. He was a torchbearer. He advised the English educated people to take up translation in all seriousness, but he did not set an, but he did set an example. He was not a mere theorist. He said he set the example first and then asked the others to follow suit, because he introduced Greek tragedy in Kannada theatre. He subjected the Indian myth to the structures and intents of Greek tragedy by writing a play called Gadayuddha Natakam in 1926, and again Ashwathama, another play in Kannada modeled on Greek tragedy in 1927. So many decades after B.M. Shrikantaya, we encounter Professor A.K. Ramanujan. He saw the need of establishing cultural relations between post-independence India and the West. He emphasized the literary value of Kannada through his translation into English. Speaking of Shiva, I just now quoted, recalled the title of the epoch-making translation work, which came out in 1973. Ever since, it has made waves in the West. So translations are forms of contact whose outcomes introduce new terms of exchange. According to one estimation, during the period prior to 1900, about 106 works came to Kannada from Sanskrit. As the printing technology improved, in the next 60 to 70 years, more than 700 translated works came into being. During the same period, some 211 works were translated directly from English, according to the book index of the University of Mysore. Okay, 211 books directly translated from English into Kannada. While translating from English, especially the works of fiction, they followed the process called familiarization. Whether it is drama and fiction, this concept of familiarization became very, very handy. What is familiarization? What is this concept called familiarization? It is nothing but making the plays and novels accessible to Kannada society and culture. In other words, translating them to reflect our own society and culture, changing the names of individuals, names of places, so on and so forth. In a way, this can be called the adaptation or familiarization. If you translate the English work, the British fiction or drama, for example, just as it is in the original, it is defamiliarization. You are not familiarizing the text to help your audiences back home, but you are keeping the audience further away from the original text. This is called defamiliarization. In the first stage of colonial period, they followed this pattern of familiarization, but not everybody thought this is an ideal approach. As an instance, I think we need to focus our attention on none other than Shakespeare, William Shakespeare. It is a test case in Kannada. I think more or less the same argument holds good in Tamil also, because almost this is a pan-Indian phenomenon, according to the experts. So Shakespeare is a test case. The process of translation or adaptation of Shakespeare's plays started in the 1870s. In the year 1870 or 1870, that decade, the process of translation and adaptation of Shakespearean plays started in Kannada, and this process is continuing even today. Earlier, Macbeth was adapted as Prataparudra Deva. That is the title given by the translator M.L. Srikantesh Gowda. Macbeth was called Prataparudra Deva. Macbeth was Veerasena, Lady Macbeth was Chandravalli, Duncan was Vijayadhwaja, Malcolm was Prataparudra Deva, witches were Shaktigalu. Now, it is interesting to note that the translator has given the name of the play. Instead of Macbeth, he calls it Prataparudradeva, the son of Duncan, Malcolm. That is, Malcolm is Prataparudradeva. That's the change. Anand Rao, another very important translator of Shakespearean plays in Kannada, he has translated The Merchant of Venice as Panchali Parinaya. Bassanio is Balabhadra, Portia is Panchali, Antony is Anandraya. Okay, this is Panchali Parinaya for The Merchant of Venice. The same translator, Anand Rao, has rendered Romeo and Juliet as Ramavarma Leelavati. Romeo is Ramavarma, Juliet is Leelavati. When both Ramavarma and Leelavati die, the Lord Vishnu appears and brings them back to life. This is the magic that has taken place in the adapted version of the Shakespearean Romeo and Juliet. That means the Indian plays had the tradition of ending on a happy note. The Indian playwrights did not, or the theatre goers or the audiences never liked any play to end on a tragic note. They always wanted the play to end on a happy note. Therefore, finally, when both Ramavarma and Leelavati die, Vishnu appears and brings them back to life. That is the happy ending. In a small book called Appropriating Shakespeare, which appeared in 1999, the author, Dr. D.S. Shankar, expresses his appreciation of Aurobindo, Maharshi Aurobindo, the great poet and thinker and writer, philosopher, calling adaptation as transmogrification. It's a bit far-fetched, but still the author, Dr. Shankar, approves of this particular change. Adaptations are called, in Aurobindo's terms, transmogrification. According to Professor Shankar, translations and adaptations are an attempt by one culture to understand another culture. Translating a work means to interpret it and to evaluate it. Simultaneously, both the processes are at work. When you translate, you are not only interpreting, you are also evaluating in your own way. So every culture, deliberately or otherwise, makes translation a source of new strength and knowledge. It's not as if translation process is an accretion which stands apart. No, it's an organic process. It becomes part and parcel of the mainstream literature because by translation, we are acquiring a new strength and new knowledge. The horizon of knowledge is increased. And the receiving culture gets what is adequate to it and in a form that is agreeable to it. This is also an interesting phenomenon to take note of. The receiving culture from English to Kannada or Kannada to English. So the receiving culture gets what is adequate to it and in the form that is agreeable to it. The act of translation, according to Kirtinath Koti, another critic in Kannada, well-known critic in Kannada, the act of translation is to be taken as a metaphor for many human, cultural, and social activities. So it is not a literary, bookish translation. Translation itself is seen in the outside world also. For example, he again corroborates that translation is not an innocent act, it is a political act. After we came into contact with the Britishers, all the changes that we see in India have been translations. For example, the educated people learning English is one form of translation. The missionaries making conversions, that is another form of translation. New modes of transportation, roads, post and telegraphs, courts and administrative machineries are all translations according to Dr. Kirtana. So anyway, we have come a long way from the British rule. Translation activity is taking place in all the languages. But one thing is observable throughout India, and that is the Indian languages are translating from English more than they are translating from their own languages into English. Somehow there seems to be a lopsided emphasis in this entire process. More and more English works are translated into the vernacular languages, but a similar kind of activity in a similar kind of volume is not taking place in the reverse order, so to say. That means we are not translating our works into English in a big way. Slowly and gradually, this lopsided activity is seeing a change. We are realizing that one-sided transaction is not wholesome and gearing ourselves up to translate from regional languages into English. Still, the field is open for those who can translate directly from, for example, French, German, Russian, Japanese, Chinese, and so on and so forth. So we should be able to get translators who can directly translate from all these global languages and vice versa. They should also translate from our language directly from Kannada to French, from Kannada to Russian, Kannada to Japanese, as the case may be, from Tamil to French, so on and so forth. I think we need to create an army of translators in order to take care of the burgeoning literature in all our languages in our country. Unfortunately, that's not happening. We are heavily depending upon English for everything. That is, the English language continues to be the window of the world. So for everything, we depend upon the English language. So much is really lost in the process. If only we can translate directly from French, German, Russian, so on and so forth. I think the loss can be minimized. And similarly, if we can translate from Tamil to French directly, the loss can be minimized. That's not happening, I said, unfortunately. For each and every activity of literary activity, we depend upon the English as the link language. So literary translations is an ongoing project, so to say. Whether academies undertake the task or not, there are some dedicated individuals who do the task unmindful of the material benefit. Academies certainly have geared themselves up and taken up the translation project in a big way, but even without the patronage of academies and the government organizations, some dedicated individuals are certainly devoting a lot of their precious time to translate works from English to regional language and vice versa for the sheer love of their mother tongue. They are doing that without expecting anything in return. So we must salute them for their selfless service as they have been a bridge between cultures. Today, I have made it a very freewheeling kind of lecture so that I have freedom to move around the subject of literary translation, which is different from technical translation, as I said at the outset. One thing I can say for sure, and that is no sane society can survive without literary translations, because no language or literature produced by that language is self-sufficient. If we have the delusion that our language is self-sufficient, I think we are going to lose a lot in the race in the world. No language is self-sufficient. No language can say the last word about knowledge in the world. Therefore, whatever that is lacking in our language and literature, we stretch our hands and pluck it from the garden adjacent to us. And language languages are flowers like flowers in a garden. So it ought to stretch its hands to other languages and make good what it lacks. At the same time, this language allows other languages to get enriched by its contribution. It's not a one-way traffic, as it were. When you accept something that your language does not have from the different sources, simultaneously you are also giving to other languages whatever richness you have, wealth of learning, wisdom you have in your language. So that is a simultaneous process, and that's how it should be. So this process is an ongoing process, and when will it stop? When will this ongoing process stop? It doesn't stop, because I can only think of an analogy to conclude my lecture. The analogy of the bees in the garden, hopping from flower to flower and sucking nectar and finally converting that into honeybee. As long as the bees in the garden skip from one flower to another and gather nectar to produce honeybee, so long scholars in different languages all over the world will continue to produce translations for the enrichment of human society. So that's the reason why I said this is an ongoing process, this is an ongoing project, it will never stop. So the microscopic minority, it cannot be a majority, it is a microscopic minority. Scholarship itself is a minority culture, so to say. Not many people are drawn to this very rarefied sphere. Not many people are drawn because it demands, it is highly demanding. You have to work with single-minded dedication to translate a work from your language to English or any other language, and a work from other languages into our mother tongue. And it is, in the end, very rewarding also, because you belong to a very valued, admired set of individuals who have, unmindful of the returns, dedicated their precious time to this literary activity. And that is the only way to safeguard our languages and literature. Because when English is looming so large, I think everyone is alerted. Everyone takes note of the English language and its development and its all-encompassing capacity. So also we have to try our best to nurture our language, nourish our languages, and we shall not give the fight. So I urge the young audience today, this afternoon, to take note of all these developments and do everything possible to safeguard the interest of our mother tongues. English will flourish. There are so many takers for English, and it is spoken all over the world. It's one of the richest languages which has widespread. But the need of the hour is to take care of our own mother tongues, our mother languages. And towards that end, I urge you, my young friends, to gear up and contribute your might in order to carry on the fight, which is a long, drawn out battle. This battle never ends. As long as we speak our language, so long we must enrich our language, drawing sustenance from various sources, and then that's the only source of redemption. Thank you. Thank you very much.